Welcome to part 2 of the series, How to Leave an Abusive Relationship. In this episode, we'll focus on achieving emotional clarity, that leaving is the right thing to do. Not just sometimes feeling like that's a good idea, but truly feeling confident enough to go through with that decision. In episode 3, we'll focus on making the physical plan to actually leave. And in episode 4, we'll focus on bringing that all together and putting that into action. There will also be 2 bonus episodes, all of which will be linked in the description below, answering FAQ and common questions. So without further ado, let's get started in this episode on how to achieve emotional clarity that leaving is the right thing to do. We'll focus on 3 major emotional clarity areas related to leaving. Number 1, the clarity that the situation is not going to get better unless you leave the relationship. If anything, it's only likely to get worse. Number 2, the clarity that if you leave, you are not a bad person and that you do not need to feel guilty or feel like you're abandoning your partner. And number 3, the clarity that you will be okay after you leave the relationship and you will be able to eventually build something better in place of what you are leaving behind. As you go through this video, please keep in mind 2 things. Number 1, each of these emotional clarity areas is a journey. You will probably not just watch this video and then feel like you've achieved emotional clarity 2 minutes later. You will most likely need to deeply think and wrestle with these topics for days or weeks, potentially talking to other people who are supportive in your life if you have people like that available to talk to. It is a long journey to achieve clarity on each of these questions, and while I will share helpful perspectives today that I find powerful and were helpful to me personally, it's probably going to take a long time for you to reach true clarity on each of these decisions. Number 2, this process usually feels terrible. It's a deeply conflicted process where you often feel like you don't know what to do, you feel like you don't have good options. It's just not a good feeling to have a person that you love who's behaving totally inappropriately and to have to make a difficult decision like this. So if you feel terrible as you go through this emotional process, please keep in mind that that is totally normal given the type of situation that you're going through, and just be patient with yourself and give yourself that grace to work through it in a way that's authentic for you. So let's jump into that first main emotional clarity area, which is clarity that the situation will not get better unless you actually leave the relationship. This is so important because so much of why people stay is that they're hoping that they can change the person or the situation. If you one day truly believe that it will not get better and that it's just going to stay like this for a year, for 2 years, forever, until you leave the relationship, it's much easier to feel clear that it's the right thing to do to leave. Today, the way we'll analyze this is with the angry racist analogy. What is the angry racist analogy? Imagine for a moment that you had a person who didn't have an abuse problem. They had a racism problem. And you, as your goal, wanted to make that person change so that they would stop being racist. Imagine you took them to anger management therapy. Would that help them stop being racist? The answer is no, because anger can make racism worse, but you can fix somebody's anger problem and they can still speak and act and react racistly. If they were a drunk racist and you sobered them up, would that fix the racism problem? No, because you could have a sober person that has racist mindsets and beliefs and speaks, acts, and reacts racistly. Here's why this is such a good analogy for abusive behavior. Racism and abusive relationships both are built on the mindset that the person is entitled to treat other people in their life in a way that is not acceptable. It's not just an emotional thing where they explode with their emotions or an alcohol thing. It's deeper than that. It's about their beliefs about their role in a relationship with other humans and how that relationship is supposed to function. An abusive person tends to believe that they are supposed to be in control most of the time. They're supposed to make most of the decisions. They're supposed to boss the other person around. They're supposed to criticize the other person whenever they want to, frequently in a demeaning way without receiving any criticism back. They don't just do that when they're upset or when they have too many drinks. They do it because they think that's their entitled role in the relationship. So why does this angry racist analogy mean that it's so unlikely for an abusive situation to get better unless you leave the relationship? The answer is that all of those things that the abusive person points to blame for their behavior, none of them are actually going to change the abusive behavior if you work on them. Abusive people will blame their stress level. They'll blame anger management. They'll blame emotions. They'll blame their partner. They'll say their partner is acting the wrong way. But you can change each of those things, and none of them will change those underlying beliefs about how they're entitled to act in the relationship. You can take them from being angry to calm. A calm person can still act abusively. You can take them from being drunk to being sober. A sober person can still act abusively. You can take them from having a bad day at a high stress level to having a good day where you make their favorite food and do all of these nice things for them, but they still have all of those mindsets and beliefs about the way that they're entitled to act in the relationship. So is it possible to work directly on those abusive perspectives about the relationship? The short answer is it is very hard and very rare for that to happen in a way that leads to actual change. If you read books and articles by mental health professionals in the space for treating abusive people, it is common for them to say that only a tiny fraction of abusive people ever actually make lasting change. It's more common for them to just repeat that pattern again and again. For example, Lundy Bancroft, who is a famous published author who wrote the book Why Does He Do That?, perhaps one of the best and most famous books on domestic violence and abusive relationships ever, was a counselor and a clinical supervisor for years, working on over 2,000 cases. In his book, he says that even in highly qualified, best abuser treatment programs, only a tiny fraction of the abusive people ever actually change. And that's for people who are in a program. What actually happens is that most abusive people don't even admit that they have a problem. They blame all these other things, right? They say, we need to change this about our environment, or you need to change this about how you act. And those are the problems. And so you can't even get to square one. So let's take a step back now and connect these ideas back to actually leaving an abusive relationship. Remember at the start of the video, I said there were three big ideas or three big emotional clarity topics we would focus on. And this first one was that the situation won't get better unless you leave the relationship. With each of these big emotional topics, it's not enough just to listen to somebody else talk about it. It's important for you to really start to feel sure that you believe that that is true for you and your situation. When I was in this situation, it wasn't enough for me to think, okay, I'm like 60% sure that these things are true. I'm 60% sure that this situation can't get better. I had to be like 90% sure, 100% sure, 200% sure. So how do you get there? How do you actually feel confident that you know that these things are true enough for you to leave? The answer is it takes work, and that work is different for each person based on their decision-making style. Some people make decisions best when they make lists and journal, and it's a very internally focused process. Others make their best decisions when they talk with friends and family members about the decision to reach clarity. Still, other people do best with research and reading books or articles or watching videos in order to reach clarity on a situation. You may have your own style that works well for you, but for you to move from like 50% clarity on these topics to 60 to 70% to 80% to 90% to 100%, you need to do the work, whatever it is for you, to get more clear on that topic. So if you're a list person and a journal person, find a way to journal about this more on your phone, in an anonymous file that you can delete later, whatever it is that you feel safe doing in that situation, but find a way to put in that time to get more clear. If you're a talker and someone who talks with friends or family, then go and find supportive friends and family and find a private time to talk with them about this topic. Do I think this person can change? I think maybe they can't change. I think maybe it's just gonna stay this way until I leave the relationship. And also do it with the other two emotional topics that we're gonna talk about in a minute. If you feel like you don't have anybody to talk to, which is common actually because of isolation or the abusive person trying to impede your relationships, I strongly encourage you to make an anonymous account on an online forum like reddit.com, reddit.com, and then go on and talk to other people anonymously, at least so that you're talking to people about the situation. If you're more of a research person or a book reader, then go find books and articles about it and read more about that topic. Can abusive people change? Can this situation be different? Whatever it is for you, the bottom line is you want to move yourself on each of these key topics towards more emotional clarity. And there are real concrete steps that you know that you can take to help yourself as a decision maker to get more clear in those areas. Now let's focus on the second big emotional topic, which is that you are not a bad person if you leave the abusive partner. You don't need to feel guilty. You don't need to feel like you are abandoning them. Please know that it's very common for people leaving abusive partners to struggle with feelings of guilt, and that I definitely struggled with this too, even when it is not actually your fault. Why is it so common common to feel guilty? Well, the first reason goes back to that feeling of love and loyalty that's often there with our loved ones. And when we're leaving somebody like that, it can feel like we're letting them down. Another big reason is the abusive person will often talk a lot about how many parts of the situation are the victim's fault. This is common for abusers to do as part of their smokescreen of blame shifting and denial of responsibility, where they're trying to make it seem like they're only acting abusively because the victim is somehow setting them off, or the victim is somehow not acting good enough, and so the abuse is happening. There's so many different reasons the abusive person will try to blame the victim, but often the person on the receiving end will pick up some of that in their mindset. So here are some very helpful ideas for dealing with those feelings of guilt or abandoning your partner. The first big one is that if somebody else is getting physical with you or screaming or acting abusively for any reason, that is on them. That is black and white. That is on them. And there is no amount of excuses or misdirection or blame shifting that will ever change that. In a normal, healthy relationship, people can make mistakes, like they forget to unload the groceries from the car and then the ice cream melts or something like that. But there are okay ways to deal with those mistakes, and there are not okay ways to deal with those mistakes, right? And so if the abusive person is using a mistake by the victim to justify abusive behavior, please note there is nothing that can ever justify abusive behavior. It's okay to talk about problems, it's okay to talk about mistakes, but what abusive people will do is take any mistake as a license to go way over the top and to cross a line. And if somebody is crossing a line, that is always on them, and that is never, ever okay. That's the first big concept. The second concept is that abusive people will try to take away all of the outs for the person on the receiving end. They'll try to make it so that they can't leave the situation and they can't retain any control over the situation and their boundaries. So for example, if the person on the receiving end of the abuse wants to go and talk about it to a friend or family member, the abusive person will usually try to prevent that. If the person wants to leave the situation, the abusive person will usually take steps to threaten or control the person to prevent them from leaving the situation. Often this will even happen if they're in the middle of an argument. If one of them tries to walk away, the abusive person will say something like, "You can't walk away from me," or "You can't disengage." Here's why this is so important for guilt and abandonment. When somebody is basically trapping you, when they're making it so that you are not able to protect your boundaries and not able to walk away, they're creating a situation where it is not your fault if you just have to disengage from that situation. They're like taking away all of your options, right? So even if the person on the receiving end has to take extreme steps, such as calling 911 or applying for a restraining order, those are actually quite justified in the case of abuse. And the person on the receiving end is not doing anything wrong to do that because the abusive person is the one who has created that situation. Now let's talk about marriage and family. It's common to feel especially guilty if you're leaving an abusive marriage and there's children involved about you being the one who's somehow broken the family. Here's a few helpful perspectives to help you feel better about this. And please know I struggled with these too. Number one, I'm not a kid psychologist, but I understand that it's very bad for children to grow up in a family where abusive behavior is happening to one of the parents. That's not good for them to experience. So if you are the parent who is ending that situation, you should probably actually feel good about that because you're removing the kids from that destructive and toxic environment. Number two, if you are ending that situation, that does not mean that it was your fault that it ended. It means that you're recognizing that it's not the right situation and you're not letting it continue. That doesn't mean that you created the situation. It doesn't mean that you are responsible for the marriage not working out or for the family not working out. It just means that you're the responsible one who's taking the right steps to protect everybody involved. And that's something that at the end of the day, you don't need to feel guilty about. At the end of the day, and 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you should actually feel proud of. If guilt is something you struggle with, please remember that's totally normal. It's so normal that it's actually common for people to feel bad about feeling guilty. So they'll experience feelings of guilt and then they'll wonder, why am I feeling guilty? I don't think this is my fault, but I feel guilty. Is there something wrong with me for having these feelings? All of that is common. Just let the emotions come and go and try to gently remind yourself that this stuff is not your fault. Now let's talk about the third and final emotional clarity area, which is that you are going to be okay after you leave this relationship. For some people, this isn't a hard one, and for some people, this is a very hard one. And either way is okay. I think it really depends on where you're coming from and what point in your life you're at. There are different flavors of feeling like you might not be okay after you leave the relationship. Part of it can be love, like it's just that person, and with that person gone, there will be this hole in your life that's irreplaceable. Another part of it, which is like a totally different flavor, is that you're losing the things that you've built up in your life to that point. You might feel like you're losing your family, or your house and your marriage, or the stable life that you've tried to build with all of that packaged together. With either of these different types of feeling like you won't be okay, the first big piece of advice I have for you is that sometimes in life, in order to move forward, we have to take a few steps backward first because we're at a dead end. And I know that doesn't make it better to hear, but it really is true. And if you take the long view and you look 5 years later, 10 years later, and you think about that choice between staying at a dead end or going backwards first in order to go forwards, it's always much better not to stay at the dead end because the dead end doesn't go anywhere good. If you're watching this video and you're in an abusive relationship, it's very unlikely that that situation is going to improve or get better for you, for your family, for any of the future things that you're worried or concerned about. Leaving that relationship might have a lot of hardship as well and might be a step backward in many areas of your life. But it's possible to continue moving forward in those areas, but it won't be possible unless you exit this relationship first, which is basically going to keep you stuck indefinitely. I know that doesn't make it easier, but I think that's the true answer, and that's the answer that's the most helpful perspective in my opinion. The second big piece of advice that I would give you is that oftentimes when it feels like something is so hard that you just can't live without it, like a certain person or leaving a certain relationship, often that's because you need other things in your life to focus on because it's easier to focus on other things rather than to not focus on something. Imagine you've just broken up with somebody and you're like trying not to think about that person. It's a lot harder to try not to think about that person than it is to think about other hobbies or other people or other friends or other friendships or things like that. So often the easier strategy, if you're feeling like you're not going to be okay or there's a void in your life that's going to be hard to fill, is to not just try to get through the sadness and the void, but also to purposely pick things to fill the void with that are more positive or stable things that you would like to have in your life. Again, I know that doesn't make it easier. This is inherently a very, very hard situation, and that's why that is one of the big 3 topics that I have in the video. So let's take one final step back. We've talked about 3 big emotional clarity topics related to leaving an abusive relationship. Number 1, that the situation will not get better unless you leave the relationship. Number 2, that it is not your fault and you are not a bad person if you leave the abusive partner. And number 3, that you will be okay, even if it will be hard in the short term or the medium term. With each of those topics, it's not enough to just listen to me or other videos talk about them. You need to work on getting emotional clarity for yourself, that those are true for you. And the way that you do that, as we talked about earlier, is dependent on your personal style for getting clearer about big decisions. If you talk to friends, go talk to friends. If you research, go research. If you're a journaler, go journal. But whatever it is for you, please take it on yourself to work on getting more clarity in those areas so that you truly one day do feel ready to actually make that decision to change your life and leave the relationship. This is not easy. It's something that takes time. It's not something that you will just finish right away, but it is worth it and you will make it there. And I really, truly believe that that's the case. In episode 3, we'll focus on the actual physical plan for how to leave an abusive relationship. And in episode 4, we'll talk about bringing that all together and actually jumping off the deep end and putting that into practice. Thanks so much for watching and see you in the next episode.